One of the most famous stories in the history of medicine isn't true. The story goes something like this. In 1854, in the Soho neighborhood of London, there was a big outbreak of cholera and nobody knew why. Then one day, a local doctor named John Snow went around town interviewing people and drew a map of where the cholera deaths occurred. He noticed a big cluster of cases around the water pump on Broad Street and concluded that drinking the water from the pump made people sick. So he removed the pump handle and the outbreak stopped. This cute little story would earn John Snow eternal Wikipedia glory as the founder of epidemiology. Unfortunately, that story is oversimplified to the point where it isn't true anymore. And that's such a shame because the real story is so much more interesting. It's got something for everybody. Colonialism and empire, scientists versus policymakers, and a ton of infighting. And I wanted to do a thorough job on this video, so I traveled to London to do some archive work and see the sites firsthand. And the first thing you need to know is that cholera didn't come by surprise to London in the 1850s. At that point, they'd been dealing with cholera outbreaks for over 20 years. This is Vibrio cholerae, the bacterium that causes the disease cholera, and it is very good at spreading. While the infectious dose varies, some people only need to ingest 10 million Vibrio cholerae to contract the disease, which is surprisingly easy. According to the Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson, a glass of water could easily contain 200 million Vibrio cholerae without the slightest hint of cloudiness. Now, if you were to accidentally drink some contaminated water, most of the ingested bacteria would die off in your stomach's acid, and the few that survived would still have to burrow through the thick mucus layer that lines the small intestine. But if they survive that, they attach to the actual small intestine cells and start replicating fast, at which point you are in for the messiest, most painful tummy ache of your life. The bacteria secrete cholera toxin, which leads to the classic symptoms of cholera: severe intestinal pain and fever, dehydration, and a violent, cloudy diarrhea called rice water stool, which I do not recommend Google image searching. And that much water loss can lead to kidney failure or shock, which is ultimately how cholera would kill you. But before you died, you'd excrete the newly multiplied bacteria through your stool. And if that stool contaminated someone else's drinking water, then you just spread cholera. The disease first came to London in 1831, and despite studying cholera epidemics in the colonies, UK public health officials were woefully unprepared. When the first case was confirmed in October, the Board of Health wrote a comically bad column in the Medical Times and Gazette. I'll link it down with all my other sources in the description, but they recommend some typical home remedies before recommending laudanum, which is a mixture of alcohol and opium. None of this would have actually cured cholera, but the laudanum would have at least taken your mind off the diarrhea for a little. The board admits it is necessary to state that no specific remedy has yet been ascertained, nor has any plan of cure been sufficiently commended by success to warrant its express recommendation from authority. Basically, there's no cure, but have we mentioned laudanum? They conclude by saying, the infection has been most virulent and has spread more rapidly and extensively in the districts of town where the streets are narrow and the population crowded, and where little or no attention has been paid to cleanliness and ventilation. They say this because they thought that diseases were spread through infected air, or what they called miasmas. I'll have a separate video all about it, but long story short, miasma theory said that noxious vapors actually caused infectious disease, and it was by far the most popular theory of disease transmission in Europe at the time. This first cholera epidemic left thousands of Londoners dead, which meant the government had to do something. And in February 1832, just 4 months after the first case of cholera in England, Parliament passed the Cholera Morbus Prevention Act, which gave their Board of Health a little more power in the name of preventing cholera. Unfortunately, it didn't have much immediate impact, partly due to corruption, but also due to lack of actionable data. Like, individual doctors would have kept health records, and some port cities recorded who came in with disease, but for the most part, governments just didn't keep track of population-level health information. This is part of epidemiology, the field of medicine that tracks population-level health. But all of this was starting to change thanks to colonialism. See, colonizers had some big financial incentives to keep health records. They couldn't invade a country and take its resources if their crew got dysentery on the journey over, and they couldn't sell people into slavery if they died while being shipped across an ocean in a cargo hull with no ventilation. Population-level health had a real impact on the English Empire's finances, so they were incentivized to pay attention. This is one of the first breaks with the standard John Snow myth. Snow didn't invent epidemiology on his own. The British Empire set up reporting systems that allowed doctors abroad to send health information back to London, and established public health infrastructure that let doctors study cholera epidemics in the colonies. This was decades before Snow's big break. Like when cholera outbreaks hit Cuba and Jamaica in the 1830s, the UK sent out doctors to investigate. It was for scummy financial reasons, but the Brits were getting experience in population-level health. Today, we'd call this epidemiological surveillance, collecting health data to inform policy and action. And this turned out to be a pretty good strategy in the colonies, so the UK rolled out a similar program at home. Again, from an economic self-interest perspective. You gotta keep the working class healthy to keep them productive, you know? So in 1836, Parliament created the General Register's Office as a way to gather mortality data like births and deaths. This would let them track and eventually improve public health. And this is where William Farr comes in. He's a massively underrated epidemiologist compared to John Snow. Farr was a surgeon, apothecary, and stats nerd who worked for the Office of the Registrar General, and his whole life was data. He talked to doctors across the country for years and tried to persuade them to include more information with their mortality reports. And eventually, he was able to charm enough doctors that he could report cause of death, location, age, and occupation of the deceased in his publication, called the Weekly Returns. And all of this new data seemed to point to one trend. Infectious disease loves dense cities, and loved the grimy, grungy, working-class neighborhoods most of all. And that leads us to our second main character, Edwin Chadwick, a progressive reformer charged with tackling the sanitation problem in poor neighborhoods. As a miasma believer, he thought that some kind of environmental condition might be leading to more miasmas, which were getting these poor people sick. So, fast forward to 1838, and a gnarly outbreak of typhus had come to London. Chadwick goes to the Poor Law Board, a kind of proto-welfare commission, and convinces them to let him investigate the outbreak. Then he invites a couple doctor collaborators to help interview union leaders, talk to factory supervisors, police, anyone who actually knew what was going on with poor people. I know, entertaining people's lived experiences. How novel. Then in 1842, he released the Report from the Poor Law Commissioners on an Inquiry into the Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population of Great Britain. And it was, despite the lengthy title, a smash hit. Well, a smash hit as far as reports about sanitary conditions go. It's a low bar. See, London was going through some growing pains. Thanks to the economic growth that came with the Industrial Revolution, London's population grew from 1.5 million people in 1800 to 6.6 million people in 1900. In 1851, there were 2.5 million people within a 30-mile radius of London, which made it the most populous city in the world at the time, and it was incredibly dense. Parts of the Soho neighborhood in particular, the home of the Broad Street Pump, had 432 people per acre, which is more than 4 times more dense than modern Manhattan. In his report, Chadwick describes how all the recent industrialization has had some clear negative impacts on public health, and if it continued, poor people were going to get screwed over way more than the rich. And this wasn't isolated to typhus. Doctors had been noticing diseases like tuberculosis creep out from the slums and into the greater London area. Plus, a French doctor had recently shown that poverty and dense urban neighborhoods led to disease. Up until this point, this new style of urban megacity was suspected of being unhealthy, but the Chadwick report solidified it. One of the big problems that Chadwick identified was the sewage situation, which means it's time for a primer on Victorian plumbing infrastructure, I'm sure the moment you've all been waiting for. If you were working class, you probably would have pooped into a chamber pot. And if you had some money, you might have used an earth closet, a kind of dry toilet. But no matter what you pooped into, your excrement was disposed of in a nearby cesspit, an underground brick pit or alley that turned your neighborhood into a latrine the size of a city block. Some of these pits hooked up to bigger pits and sewer lines that dumped into the River Thames, but for the most part, the waste just sat there. Also, just an aside, sometimes these cesspits leaked highly flammable methane, which would explode into fireballs. Now, flushing toilets were a thing by the 1840s, but they ultimately emptied into the Thames too, which was getting more and more polluted thanks to all this wastewater. Drinking water was a whole other problem. See, sewage laws were regulated by local parish governments, not coordinated citywide planning. So by the mid-1800s, there were over 200 local sewage acts in London and 10 privately owned water companies. And one of their services was supplying water to above-ground pumps where people could get drinking water. These companies got their water from different intake points on the Thames, the same river everyone was dumping their wastewater into. As a bonus source of danger, those sketchy brick cesspits could leak and contaminate the drinking water after it had been drawn from the Thames, giving you another way of ingesting your neighbor's cholera excreta. Knowing what you know about cholera, you can see the problem here. Wastewater had a few routes for getting into your drinking water. And while Edwin Chadwick didn't know how cholera worked, he still concluded that you could seriously reduce overall illness and mortality by implementing some kind of waste removal system. So he started working with a sewer engineer to design a brand new citywide sewer system, one that would pump a constant supply of fresh water into people's homes with a separate line that routed wastewater to the countryside where it would be repurposed as manure, which would keep the river clean. It was a great idea that probably would have saved a lot of lives, but neither Chadwick nor the Poor Law Board had the authority to pull it off. Remember, London was not only the biggest city in the world, but it was fractured into all kinds of local governing bodies. So to get the kind of legislative firepower he'd need, Chadwick didn't make a public health argument, he made an economic argument. Chadwick campaigned for years to make any kind of change, and eventually he convinced Parliament that investing in public health would improve the economy. Literally, that's what it says in the bill. This resulted in two laws passed in 1848. The first was the Public Health Act, which created a temporary General Board of Health with a 5-year conditional approval. They'd have the power to approve local government sanitation spending and give some guidance during epidemics, and their first president would be Edwin Chadwick. The second law was a revision to the Nuisances Removal and Disease Prevention Act. In practicality, this gave individual neighborhood parishes the power to deal with public health issues. And by public health issues, we're really just talking about poop. The law states that if any dwelling house or building is in a filthy and unwholesome condition, or that there are upon such premises any foul and offensive cesspool, drain, gutter, or ditch, or any accumulations of filth, or that swine are so kept as to be a nuisance or injurious to health, the authorities shall examine or cause the premises to be examined, and if upon examination or upon a medical certificate of two legally qualified practitioners, it appears that the nuisance exists, then they'd make you deal with the nuisance at the owner's expense. Basically, get rid of the cesspits and get rid of them now. And oh boy, did they. Over the next few years, these local parishes destroyed tens of thousands of pits, but there was just one little problem. People still needed to poop. And unfortunately, Chadwick's vision for a sparkly new sewage system was still years away, so in the meantime, people's best option was to dump their waste into the sewers, which flowed into the Thames. And so, we get one of the biggest unexpected consequences in public health history. The Nuisances Removal Act actually increased the amount of cholera bacteria in the drinking water. It would be hilarious if it weren't for the epidemic levels of death. But if you believed in the miasma theory like Chadwick, then this was fine. A polluted river wasn't ideal, but it was better than the noxious fumes coming from the cesspits. Now, all of this legislation was happening during London's second cholera epidemic, which started earlier in 1848 and lasted until 1849, at which point our old statistician friend William Farr started assembling a report. And after sifting through all that data, Farr saw a pattern that led him to a novel, albeit totally incorrect hypothesis. He said that cholera infections varied inversely with elevation. So if you lived at sea level, close to the river, you got sick more often. If you lived up on a hill, you got sick less often. And it was classic miasmatous thinking. The miasma vapors from the Thames were getting you sick, so living further away from the source of the stink kept you safe. Now viewers, I don't need to tell you that Farr was seeing a correlation, not a causation. And he was called out for it. A local doctor called the elevation hypothesis a remarkable coincidence. And that doctor was none other than John Snow, the guy that supposedly this video is about, but is being introduced at, what, the 13-minute mark? Some short background on Snow. He was a bit of an outsider in the London medical community. He was an anesthesiologist, which if you watched my video on the topic, and you can find that right here, you know it was a brand new profession at this point. Snow was only 18 years old during the 1831 cholera outbreak, and thought about the disease like a normal miasma believer. But following the 1849 outbreak, Snow noticed something. Cholera didn't start with systemic symptoms like fever or the chills, but with local symptoms isolated to the gut. In cholera, the alimentary canal is first affected, and that all the symptoms not referable to that part are consecutive and apparently the result of the local affection. In this case, the local affection was the tidal wave of diarrhea acting in the intestines. So Snow reasoned that something was acting directly in the gut to have such a sharp effect. And whatever that thing was must be ingested by mouth and excreted in the diarrhea. Having rejected effluvia and the poisoning of the blood in the first instance, and being led to the conclusion that the disease is communicated by something that acts directly on the alimentary canal, the excretions of the sick at once suggest themselves as containing some material which, being accidentally swallowed, might attach itself to the mucous membrane of the small intestine and there multiply itself by the appropriation of surrounding matter, in virtue of molecular changes going on within it, or capable of going on as soon as it is placed in congenial circumstances. And it's an interesting conclusion. He knew cells and microbes were a thing, but he didn't have any microscopic evidence that a germ caused cholera. But thanks to all of Farr's data collection, he did have death statistics broken down by geography, and he noticed that the south of London had a much bigger per capita death rate than the other areas. And after noticing that these neighborhoods were supplied with water from a more polluted part of the Thames, his hypothesis started coming together. Something in the water could transmit cholera. This is our second big break with the standard John Snow myth. He didn't have a breakthrough moment after investigating cholera in 1854, he came up with the idea 6 years earlier. Snow published his own cholera report on the mode of the communication of cholera in 1849, and it didn't really convince anyone that the disease was waterborne. In fact, our dear friend William Farr read the report and thought it actually supported his elevation hypothesis. All that contaminated water was spewing out miasmas, which was the true source of the infection, and he admits this much in his 1852 report. The wide, simmering waters were breathing incessantly into the vast sleeping city tainted vapors, which the temperature of the air at night would not sustain. God, that's beautiful. Either way, Farr started reporting where the deceased got their water from in his weekly reports from there on out. So by the end of the epidemic, nobody believed Snow's idea. And to be fair, he was making revolutionary claims without good evidence to support his argument. Now, unluckily for Snow, but luckily for the people of London, 1850 through 1853 were quiet cholera years. So Snow spent that time reading as much as he could about outbreaks across England, especially through Farr's reports. But cholera finally came back in 1853, which gave Snow an opportunity to prove he was right. This third epidemic really started heating up by the summer of 1854. By mid-August, London was seeing 644 cases of cholera a week. On July 31st of 1854, the original Board of Health's 5-year run was coming to a close, and since Parliament was pretty sick of Chadwick at this point, they dissolved his board and replaced it with a new, weaker Board of Health the next day, August 1st. On August 12th, they named a new board president, Sir Benjamin Hall, who immediately started building a team to investigate the outbreak and help the sick. I know he's no Chadwick, but he seems to care. At the same time, John Snow had been reading as much about the epidemic as he could and was preparing a report of South London. Cases kept picking up in August, but on Friday, September 1st, cases started spiking, led by a particularly sharp rise in cases in the Golden Square area of Soho, Snow's home turf. So that Sunday, September 3rd, Snow comes out to Golden Square so he can analyze water from their multiple water pumps, including the now famous Broad Street pump. He was certain he'd find something that proved cholera was waterborne. But he didn't find anything out of the ordinary in his analysis, so he needed a different strategy. Snow had been following the water company infrastructure story ever since the 1848 epidemic, and he knew only 2 companies supplied the outbreak zone: Southwark and Vauxhall, or S&V, which pumped in water from the Battersea area, and Lambeth, who used to get their water from a little further downstream, but had since switched to a cleaner section of the Thames, which was miles upstream. This gave Snow a natural experiment. The houses were right next to each other, so they'd be exposed to the same miasmas, but houses supplied by S&V drank dirtier water, so they ought to have more cholera cases than houses supplied by Lambeth. And sure enough, Snow's analysis showed that no household supplied by Lambeth got cholera, but about 1% of households supplied by S&V did. But there were some confounders. Lambeth tended to supply wealthier, cleaner neighborhoods, while S&V supplied smoggier, more industrial neighborhoods. So while Snow must have been stoked to get any quality of supporting evidence, the miasma model could still explain the delta in deaths. So he would need even more detail to prove his hypothesis. At this point, Snow goes door to door and does his interviews. That part of the standard Jon Snow myth is true. And since he lived in the area for a while, he knew that people didn't always go to the geographically closest water pump. This is when he noticed that a bunch of people in the outbreak area were getting water from the same pump on Broad Street. Also, not to nerd out too hard, but seeing the pump in person was a very, very cool moment for me, even if it is a replica. Next, he started looking for exceptions to his pattern. Like, there was a factory a few blocks away that had a high concentration of deaths, but was closer to another pump. Well, it turns out that the factory bosses gave their employees water from the Broad Street pump. And on the flip side, there was a brewery really close by that didn't have any cholera deaths. Obviously the pump is there, but then the brewery would have been around there. After interviewing the boss and employees, Snow learned that they had their own private water line, and everyone drank beer anyway. In a letter to the Medical Times and Gazette a few days later, Snow writes, "I found that nearly all the deaths had taken place within a short distance of the pump. There were only 10 deaths in houses situated decidedly nearer to another street pump. In 5 of these cases, the families of the deceased persons informed me that they had always sent to the pump in Broad Street, as they preferred the water to that of the pumps which were nearer. In 3 cases, the deceased were children who went to school near the pump in Broad Street." With regards to the deaths occurring in the locality belonging to the pump, there were 61 instances in which I was informed that the deceased persons used to drink the pump water from Broad Street, either constantly or occasionally. The result of the inquiry, then, is that there has been no particular outbreak or prevalence of cholera in this part of London except among among the persons who were in the habit of drinking the water of the above-mentioned pump well. So at this point, it's Tuesday, September 5th, and the Board of Health started their own investigation into Golden Square. They formed a new committee called the Committee for Scientific Inquiries, or CSI, which is just perfect for disease detectives, and who's the lead? None other than my man, William Farr. But the CSI wasn't just a bunch of stats nerds. They had a chemist, a microscopist, and a meteorologist. And that last one seems weird until you remember that the entire board believed in the miasma theory, so a meteorologist was there to interpret if the weather might be influencing the miasmas that they thought spread cholera. And here's what's wild. They were able to test the air for germs in 1854. The chief chemist took a big tank, put it outside, and sucked in air. Then he distilled the water vapor and looked at that water under a microscope. And he found all kinds of stuff. Fungi, hair, and a few vibriones, which is what they called any long, wiggly microbe back then. The chemist repeated the trials in the empty ward of a hospital, then a full hospital ward, and a half-full hospital ward. Half empty if you're an optimist, I guess. He only found vibriones in the full ward, which seems like it supported miasma theory. But the chemist hedged his findings, saying it would be premature to infer a connection between the disease and these organisms until extensive comparative trials have been made on other conditions of air. Meanwhile, the microscopist went looking at water samples from the different water companies and got really similar data to snow. Lambeth water had way less stuff floating around it than S&V water. Also, archival work pro tip, always read the appendix. It's where they keep the good stuff like these drawings. The microscopist also got the pleasure of looking at the rice water stools under a microscope, including 2 samples immediately after they were evacuated, which had to be a rough day at the office. He saw vibriones in every sample he looked at, which almost convinced him that the germ caused cholera, but he ultimately dismissed it. He thought the vibriones liked the conditions of a cholera victim's intestines, but he didn't believe that they caused the illness. So at this point, both Snow and the Board of Health had interviewed the residents of Golden Square and had started writing their reports. But in the meantime, they still needed to figure out how to stop the outbreak. One of their main strategies was scattering chloride of lime on the streets, which would have countered the smells from the cholera miasmas. They actually did the same thing a few decades later for a plague outbreak in San Francisco, which I made a video all about and you can find right here. That Thursday night, September 7th, the local parish held a meeting about the cholera outbreak and Snow showed up with a pretty clear warning. The vast majority of the dead got their water from Broad Street. He didn't go on a tirade about miasma theory, he just stayed focused so he could make his recommendation, which was to remove the pump handle. The board wasn't immediately convinced, but they figured, things are really bad out there, what do we got to lose? So the next day, Friday, September 8th, the board shut down the pump and waited. The death toll in Soho was still high for the next week or so. It definitely wasn't the instant proof of concept described in the standard Jon Snow myth. But after a few days, it started to look like the worst of the epidemic was behind them. The truth is, nobody really thought about the pump handle at the time. Nobody except for this guy, Henry Whitehead. He was a local priest and doctor in the Soho area, and he was pissed at Snow. This was Whitehead's turf, and the waterborne theory was stupid. He was team miasma all day. He even wrote his own report of the outbreak, which has some of the miasmatists' greatest hits. Like he said, the atmosphere all over the world is at the time favorable to the production of a most formidable plague, probably referring to all the air pollution. He didn't make a case against Snow's waterborne theory, but he publishes this thing and it gets pretty widely read in the community. A few months go by, the epidemic fades, and in November, the local parish vestry put together yet another committee to investigate the outbreak. That's 4 reports now. So the vestry thought, great, the Board of Health already has all this data, we can learn a lot from it. But the board says no. The vestry should go do their own independent investigation. So the residents turned to their local hero doctors and invited Jon Snow and Henry Whitehead onto the committee to work together. See what I mean about the real story being so much more interesting? These dudes hated each other and now they had to work together in order to help their community, and it never gets told in the actual story. Whitehead went into the process believing that if he could document how people survived drinking Broad Street pump water, then Snow's theory would fall apart. But almost all of his interviewees had some kind of connection to Broad Street. About 60% of Broad Street drinkers got sick, while only 10% of non-Broad Street drinkers got sick. Whitehead started doubting his original hypothesis, but he couldn't get his head around the idea that the Board of Health could look at the water under a microscope, see it was clean, and it could still cause disease. And that's where Snow comes back in. Snow clarified that he didn't blame cholera on the general cleanliness of water, but whether or not it was contaminated by stool from a cholera victim. Whitehead said, all right, let's check the pipes around the pump. Maybe there's some stool leaking in somehow. But that was a dead end. A sewer engineer named Edmund Cooper had just recently inspected all the pipes in the neighborhood and said that everything was okay. He was responding to rumors that recent construction had disturbed an ancient plague burial pit that was releasing miasma up to the surface, which caused the cholera. Cooper looked into all the gutters and possible venting areas and concluded that there was no connection between leaky gutters and deaths, which of course absolves him and his department of any more work. He also found no link between any of the local sewers and the Broad Street pump. So Whitehead pivoted. He went digging through the cholera data, looking for whose death might have been the very first case that kicked off the epidemic, what's called the index case. Given the time frame of cholera, he figured that the contamination must have happened sometime around August 28th. So he read through Farr's weekly returns and only found 2 nearby cholera deaths that fit the bill, both of which happened pretty far away from Broad Street, so neither of those was the likely index case. For weeks, Whitehead was stuck. At this point, he had memorized the publicly available weekly returns and moved on to primary records at the Register General's office. And that's when he saw the breakthrough clue. On September 2nd, a 5-month-old baby girl died at 40 Broad Street, literally right next to the pump. According to the records, the baby had been suffering from diarrhea since August 29th. Cholera can kill adults in a matter of hours after the onset of symptoms, so it made sense that the baby's death was attributed to the milder diarrhea instead of cholera, but it was possible that the baby had been misdiagnosed. Whitehead immediately ran off to 40 Broad Street to interview the baby's mother. The mom said that they had washed the baby's used diapers and dumped some of the wastewater into a cesspit in front of their house. So Whitehead got permission to dig up the sewage system under the house and around the pump and found that the drain's bricks had decayed to the point where it was leaking into the pump's water supply. Everything finally lined up. The disease, the timing, the infrastructure evidence. So Whitehead tells Snow what he found, and they started writing their report for the local parish vestry in early 1855. At this point, they weren't just tolerating each other, they were close friends. This was the moment Snow had been waiting for. Not the friendship, the science. He had solid evidence to back up his waterborne transmission hypothesis and an audience ready to listen to him. Now he just had to make a convincing argument. And to do that, he decided to draw a map. The map, the famous one. And this is my biggest complaint with the standard Jon Snow myth. The map didn't lead him to an idea. Needing to communicate his idea led him to make a map. The map wasn't new data, it was science communication. See, in 1849, a doctor named Thomas Shapter drew a map as part of his report on Exeter's 1832 cholera outbreak. This showed Snow that a map could be a powerful data visualization tool, and this report was likely the inspiration for the Broad Street map. What made Snow's map so convincing was its simplicity. It didn't show anything except for streets, pump locations, and deaths represented by thick tally marks. No plague pits, no sewer lines, or elevation. He purposely only shows what he wants to show, which leads the viewer to associate the deaths with the pump. Snow presented his map to the vestry committee after Whitehead had found the index case, and when everything was taken together, it worked. The local parish endorsed the waterborne hypothesis. This was a huge win for Snow. But he still wasn't happy with his argument. A miasmatist could still read the map and conclude that the miasmas were coming from the Broad Street pump. And it's easy to see why. When you look at the original map, you see the death's relationship to the pump as the crow flies, but that doesn't reflect which pumps people actually got their water from. So, Snow revised the map and added something called a Voronoi diagram. Basically, he added a dotted line to show the area in which the Broad Street pump was the closest pump in walking distance. This meant he had to walk through the little side streets and alleys to the closest pump. Again, another great science communication choice. It clearly showed how most of the cholera victims got their water from the Broad Street pump. The final piece of the battle was convincing the staunchly miasmatist Board of Health that the disease was waterborne. Part of that was pointing out how the evidence didn't support Farr's elevation hypothesis. And ultimately, they conceded a little bit. In the appendix, they say, Dr. Snow, in a paper dated August 29, 1849, advanced a theory of the pathology of cholera, and it is in any respects the most important theory that has yet been propounded. Snow published a second edition of On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, this time writing a full book instead of a little pamphlet. But still, the paradigm hadn't fully shifted yet. This was great evidence against miasma theory, but it didn't start a revolution. By the 1860s, Chadwick's big plans for a new sewer system finally became a reality after hiring engineer Joseph Bazalgette. It was an enormous project on par with the Eiffel Tower. At this point, William Farr had ditched the elevation hypothesis and was on team waterborne. So when cholera came back in 1866, he knew to look to the water supply. And early data seemed to show more cholera deaths in the neighborhood supplied by the East London Waterworks Company. So he warned people near the outbreak to avoid water that hadn't been boiled and started an investigation. It turned out that the water company hadn't complied with Chadwick's instructions for the sewage update and were still illegally pumping in water from an old contaminated water source. Farr called them out, they changed their intake point, and mortality rates in their district dropped soon afterwards. It was the last cholera epidemic that London would ever have. In his 1867 report, Farr gave quite a bit of posthumous credit to Snow. His work had turned the current in the direction of water, and tended to divert attention from the atmospheric doctrine, talking about miasma. He wasn't ready to let go of miasma theory completely, but he acknowledged that waterborne transmission explained the vast majority of cholera cases. Part of what led him to change his mind was that the world of science was changing around him. A scientist in France was starting to get the idea that maybe those microscopic organisms could cause disease. This would become known as germ theory. Check out this video if you want that part of the story.